This week on Tuesday Tea with Charlie G, I'm going to talk to you about the worst job ever. It's Tuesday Tea with Charlie G. Spend some time with me. Tell me what you see. We'll have encouraging lessons, counting all of our blessings. It's Tuesday with Charlie G. Yeah, that's me. As I said in the beginning of this little clip, I wanted to talk to you about the worst jobs ever, right? Some of you may know me. I have worked since the time I was about 13 or 14 years old. Many of you have jobs, right? And some of those jobs just aren't very good. And so, like, I had a job where I was actually tying the tops of Christmas trees with rubber bands and clipping off the buds so that the tree would grow up straight. Can you believe that's a job? And so I was in high school and I'd go out in the field and I had a pocket full of rubber bands and I'd sit there and I'd tie up the Christmas tree and clip off, you know, the nubs so that the one leader would come up straight. And hours and hours in the hot sun walking in these Christmas tree fields up in Michigan. That was a job that I had. And it was a horrible job. It was cold and wet in the morning and it was hot and brutal in the afternoon. Okay, so you type in some of the worst jobs that you've had and just type it out into the comments and share some of the worst jobs that you've ever had in your life. You know, I had a job where I actually worked for one of these delivery companies, and I won't mention the name, right? You can think of who it is. And I had to go to work to help load the trucks in the morning, right? So all the trucks would be backed up against this conveyor belt and all these packages would come down through the center. And I had 3 or 4 trucks that I was in charge of finding the addresses that fit to my trucks and putting them in the box trucks. Okay, that's a hint for who I was working for. The box trucks, and put the addresses in order in the truck. It was a crazy job because the conveyor belt was full of boxes and packages and they were all different sizes and different weights and different places. And if it wasn't your address, then you got confused. And it was like, you know, you ever seen that old Lucille Ball comedy show where the chocolates are coming down the entry and she just gets lost and you keep Okay, so here's what made that job the worst that it could ever be. It was in the morning. So it was called a preload shift. So you're preloading those box trucks to go out in the morning. I had to go to work at 2:30 in the morning. I worked from 2:30 to 8:30 every day, Monday through Friday. It was a horrible job, right? It was terrible. Here's what I want to share with you today. Some of you, if you were going to create the worst job in the world, what would it be? Type into the comments there, what would be the characteristics of the worst possible job that you could ever have, right? Let's reverse engineer a bad job. Well, you know what? I'm not alone in this because I just heard a podcast earlier this week with a great guy named Patrick Lencioni. Patrick Lencioni, on his podcast called At the Table podcast, he talks about the worst jobs ever. And so this isn't my original thought, but I'm going to spin it just a little bit. Number one, if you were going to create the worst job ever, okay, you would want no relationships. Right? No relationship in your terrible job. So people didn't get along with each other, they didn't know each other, and they didn't even talk to each other, right? And that's back to my delivery truck driver job. I didn't really talk to anybody. My boss was kind of a mean guy, and he just yelled at you to hurry up and go faster. He didn't care about you. He didn't have a relationship with you. My coworkers were all stressed out, right? We're all doing this job. And that made that job a terrible job because there was no relationships amongst the people, okay? Patrick Lencioni also says that another way to make a job a terrible, terrible job is to have no purpose, right? A lot of jobs that I have had, nobody told me why I was doing it, right? And all jobs are important. All jobs are very important. But if you don't ever talk to the person and you don't ever understand why you're doing what you're doing, and you have no purpose in your work, that's a rotten job. That's a terrible job, right? You have no relationships with anybody. You have no purpose in what you're doing. And then here's the third criteria to make a terrible, terrible job. If you have no feedback in your job, and you don't know how you're doing, you don't know if you're doing a good job or a bad job, and you don't really hear from anybody, that makes for a terrible work environment, right? You don't have any relationships with people, you don't know why you're there, and you don't know whether you're doing a good job or not. These are the three main characteristics that I would put out there if you wanted to create a real terrible job, right? Now, you remember my story about the prodigal son and Tom Gerrentzer's story from the podcast? Think about the prodigal son. The prodigal son basically was working all by himself with a bunch of pigs at the end right there. He had no purpose in his life other than to feed the pigs, and he was going nowhere, and nobody, I would guess, was telling him whether he was doing a good job or a bad job. The prodigal son found himself in a terrible working position, right? And so he just said, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this without you. And so he was going home, right? He was going home. Let me tell you what I was doing here. See, I just flipped this around. Like, I want you, if you're in charge of people today, if you're the boss, right? If you're the boss of people, I want you to be aware of this, because I used to be the boss of people too. And I kind of made these mistakes sometimes, but I always tried to get to know the people that I was working with, right? I wanted to know when their birthday was, or I wanted to know how many kids they had, or how their life was going. And, you know, we would try to build a relationship with the people that we were working with, right? And we tried to instill that in others so that they would get along better, right? I also always tried to explain to people why we were doing what we were doing, right? Here's the reason that we want you to do this. Because this does this, and this leads to this, and this is why we exist, right? As an organization. So you always have to emphasize with people how they're, why they're doing what they're doing. Like, this job is so important because it reaches these people, or it does this thing for the organization. If you can emphasize that, you give people purpose in their job. And then finally, this is a big one. Organizations oftentimes don't give enough feedback to the people that they're trying to lead. I know I struggled with that as a worker. Am I doing it right? Am I doing a good job? Am I doing a bad job? How can I get better? How can I, am I going to get a raise? Am I going to get any chance for advancement here? That's often what you need to do. And even if it's hard, I would guess that if you're working a job, and even if you were doing something wrong, you'd want somebody to tell you, right? You'd want your feedback. But here's the deal. If you don't have any relationships, you don't have any purpose, and you don't have any feedback in your job, guess what? You're going to leave. You're going to go. You're going to go somewhere else, right? And so here's what I would want you to do. I would want you to make sure that your people know that you care for them, right? That your people know that what they're doing serves a greater purpose for the organization. And I would want your people to know how they're doing, right? You see that little wordplay I just did there? That's about it for me, but what I want to end with is I want to tell you, remember that old show that Mike Rowe made famous? It was called Dirty Jobs. Remember the Dirty Jobs show? Give me a thumbs up or a heart if you remember the Dirty Jobs television show. Dirty Jobs was a pretty funny show, right? And 50% of the jobs were all about poop or something really, really nasty, right? But here's what I remember about that show. The great part about that show is that Mike Rowe would meet these guys or gals, and they were doing a really nasty job. Like they were dirty, or they had to move something, or had to do something. It was just nasty. But because they had relationships, they had purpose, and they knew where they were, they actually, by the end of those shows, would say, this job's pretty good. It's not too bad, right? That always amazed me, that you'd have this guy that was in charge of just the nastiest stuff, but because he had purpose, relationship, and feedback in his job, he would keep doing that dirty job. And so I want to encourage you today. If you're missing these things, go try to make them in your environment, okay? If you're lacking those things, tell your boss. This is what I need. These are the things that I need most. I hope you have a great week. That's about it for me. And I'm going to sing us out here on Tuesday Tea with Charlie G on my little funny mandolin. I say it's Tuesday Tea with Charlie G. Spend some time with me. Tell me what you see. We'll have encouraging lessons. Counting all of our blessings. It's Tuesday with Charlie G. Yeah, that's me. Have a great week, everybody.